allow us all to return now to chapter 3 in our study of Where is Wisdom. We're reading the book of Mishle, and what we'll do is, as is our custom and approach, we'll go through a reading of the entire chapter, and then we'll make some observations, take some questions, and I'll share a few reflections. This chapter of 35 verses is again quite interesting in terms of how it's constructed, and we'll see some recurring themes.
You only have to wait a few minutes.
We'll see how this this recurs, and specifically chapters 1 through 9 sets out a program, a kind of curriculum that that we have been exploring together, and as we explore it further, we'll see what chapter 3 has to contribute to that process. So I'm going to go around the Zoom room, and we'll do 5 verses each. If you can follow along with me and read the English as I read the Hebrew, that would be great. So welcome to everyone. So we're on chapter 3. I'll start with Morton. Beni torati al tishkach umatzati umitzvotai yitzor libecha. You're on mute, Morton.
I'm sorry. My child, forget not my teaching, but let your heart keep my command.
Ki orech yamim ushnot chaim v'shalom yosifu lach.
For length of days and years of life and peace will they add for you.
Chesed ve'emet al yazveka, kashrem al gargarotecha, katvem al luach libecha.
Kindness and truth will not forsake you. Bind them round your neck, write them upon the tablet of your heart.
U'metzachen v'sechel tov b'nei Elohim v'adam.
So shall you find grace and good regard in the eyes of God and humanity.
Batach el Adonai b'chol libecha va'el binatcha al tisha'en.
Trust in Hashem with all your heart rather than leaning upon your own understanding.
Great. Okay, Shirley, we're going to continue with 6. B'chol drachecha da'ehu v'hu yeyasher orchotecha.
In all your ways, cultivate awareness of the one so that your paths will be on the level.
Al tehi chacham beinecha yiret Adonai v'sur merah.
Be wise in your own eyes, revere Adonai, and swerve from evil.
Right? Be not. Al tehi chacham. Don't be wise in your own eyes. Refuot tehiyeh lesarecha v'shakui la'atzmotecha.
Let it be healing for your flesh and a balm to your bones.
Kabed et Adonai mehonecha umereshit kol tvuotecha.
Honor Adonai more than your wealth and then with the first fruits of your crop.
V'yimalu asamecha sava v'tirosh yekavecha yifrotzu.
So shall your barns be filled with abundance, your vats shall overflow with new wine.
Great. Okay, Marian. 11. Musar Adonai beni al tim'as al takutz betochachato.
My child, despise not the ethical reproof of Adonai, neither spurn the coarse correction.
Ki et asher yahav Adonai yochiach uche'av et ben yotzer.
For whom Adonai loves, such a person's course is corrected, and like a father his son regards him kindly.
Ashrei Adam matzah chochma ve'adam yapik tevuna.
Enriched is the one who has found wisdom and the one that acquires understanding.
Ki tov sochra u'mischar kasef u'mecharutz tevuata.
For her worth is better than silver, and her yield better than fine gold.
Yekara hi mipninim v'chol chafatzecha lo yishvuva.
More precious is she than pearls, and all your cherished things are incomparable to her.
Alan, 16. Orech yamim b'yamina bismola osher v'chavod.
Length of days is in her right hand, in her left hand wealth and honor.
Drachecha darchei noam v'chol netivoteha shalom.
Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace.
Eitz chaim hi lamachazikim ba v'tomcheha me'ushar.
She is a tree of life to those who grasp her, and enriched are those who hold her.
Adonai b'chochma yasad haaretz konen shamayim bituna.
Through wisdom, Adonai founded the earth. By understanding, set the heavens firm.
B'da'ato tehomot nivka'u u'shechakim yir'afu tal.
Bursting from the ancient ocean to the skies, dripping dew, this knowledge.
Okay. Marion, 21. B'ni al yaluzu me'enecha netzor toshia u'mezima.
My child, let these things not slip away from your eyesight. Keep sound wisdom and discretion,
V'hiyu chayim lenafshecha v'chen legargarotecha.
and they will be a life-protecting amulet round your neck and grace to your gullet's desire.
Al telech levetach drachecha ve'raglecha lo tigof.
Then you can walk forward without any stumbling, so your foot shall not be bruised.
Im tishkav lo tifchad ve'shachavta ve'orva shnatecha.
If you lie down, you shall be unafraid. You shall lie down and have sweet dreams.
Al tira pachad pitom u'misat reshaim ki tavo.
Be unafraid neither of sudden terror nor of the plight of the wicked when it comes.
Morton, ki Adonai hiyeh bichselcha v'shamar raglecha milached. Verse 26.
He's muted.
Morton, if you can unmute.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep the baby's noise away from the crowd. For Adonai will be your security and will guard your foot from getting ensnared.
Al timne tov mi ba'alav b'hiyot le'el yadecha la'asot.
If you have the power to do good to the deserving, withhold nothing. If you can repay a loan when due, do so.
Al tomar la're'echa lech v'shuv machar eten v'yesh itach.
If your neighbor is trusting, be worthy of that trust, not saying, go and come, and tomorrow I'll give when you have it.
Al tacharosh al re'echa ra'a v'hu yoshev lavetach itach.
If your neighbor is peaceful, pick not fights if he or she dwells peacefully alongside you.
Al tariv im adam chinam im log malcha ra'a.
If there is no reason to quarrel, then do not find reason to inflict such harm.
Al tekane be'ish chamas va'al tivchar bechol drachav, surely.
If you abide amongst the lawless, do not envy or imitate their ways.
Ki toevat Adonai nalaz ve'et yisharim tzodo.
For the crooked one is despised by Adonai, while the upright remain intimate of the one.
Meirat Adonai beveit rasha ve'nevei tzadikim yavarech.
A curse upon in the house of the wicked, but Adonai blesses the abode of the righteous.
Im leitzim hu yalitz la'anavim yiten chen.
As for the scoffers, Adonai scoffs at them, but unto the humble he gives favor.
Kavod chachamim yinchalu u'chsilim merim kalon.
For the wise inherit honor, but as for the fools, they carry away disgrace.
Wonderful. All right. So, what are some of the things that you notice about chapter 3 in terms of structure as well as in terms of theme relative to what we've seen so far in the first two chapters? Any thoughts or reflections or questions?
There's a reference to Adonai that is absent from most of the other chapters we've read so far.
It's interesting, right? So now, for some reason, this is a cue for something. So that's a good note there by Alan. We'll have to figure out why that's the case. Anything else you noticed or questions you have? Marianne, and then Morton.
This chapter reads more like a physical map than any chapter we've had before. You know, even to the reference to paths in verse 6, but also in reference to how the foot travels that path. So the physical body and the physical placement of being in the right place is. But just the foot, and then the body is being upright, and then the inherited quality of something almost a physical life,
Right.
but an inherited quality that's passed down. That struck me.
Okay, so the physicality of the path and the inherited sense of this transmission, or even of this path, that is something that's striking. Okay. Others observations? Yep, Morton.
You started the translation with "my child" for Beni, but it really it's not addressed to a child. So it may be one's child in the sense that my grown children are still my children, but
It's true.
it creates a misimpression, actually, because it's obviously directed to someone who is operating in the world, has neighbors, is making loans perhaps, and so on. So it's
Right.
yeah.
Well, we talked about it before. Part of what's being done here is the metaphor of the parent and the child relationship, the father, the mother, the son, the daughter, the sense of mentorship here. So it's my child in the sense of an elder speaking to a young disciple. So you're right, it's a metaphor, but unfortunately, the English seems to lock us into associations that they're not necessarily there in the Hebrew. And we talked about the paucity of words that are possible in the Hebrew relative to the richness and the breadth in English of 75,000 to 750,000. So it's true, you're right. There is a little bit of inequity here in terms of how we're capturing it in the English and the registers that are operating in the Hebrew. But the sense of discipleship here is important. And in terms of the richness of the word ben, I would just refer you to a really, really interesting book called Ben by Moshe Idel, Idel. He's done a massive study of the word Ben and its register and its implications, not only for Judaism, but for Christianity. So it's actually within Jewish mysticism, it's a very important word. And the usage of bat, which means daughter, and the places where that occurs, as opposed to the places where Ben occurs, are a whole host of other issues for discussion that we're not going to enter into now. But there's a kind of a history that extends beyond this book, and what the meaning of each of those words are extremely important. So it's an important point that you raised, Martin. Other observations, Shirley?
So it's the introduction of wisdom again as the female. And
Yes.
that starts in line 13.
Right. And how do we know that in the Hebrew? Just so that we know that I'm, even though we may take issue with my my capitalizing, etc., but already, if you look at the Hebrew, as Shirley's pointing out, so it's not a man, but it's an Adam, first of all. So this is open to the human being that wants to seek wisdom. And 13 says, Ashrei Adam. I just said the one, but it's really the human beings. It's very universal. Matzah chokhmah ve'adam yafik tfuna. So both chokhmah and tfuna are feminine gerunds or nouns. And then we see that because the proof is in from 14 onwards, as Shirley commented. If you look in the Hebrew, you'll notice, for example, the third word says sochra, and inside the hey, there's a dot, and the last word tuata, there's a dot. Do you see that in verse 14?
Yeah.
So that's called in grammar, it's called a mapik in the hey. it's a point in the letter Hey, which means that the referent is feminine. So it's referring to her, which goes back to verse 13, which is chokhmah, probably more than tfuna, because chokhmah, as you said, we see throughout these chapters, woman wisdom is extremely important, and she's always personified in the feminine. But the other attributes that are related to her, like wisdom, like understanding, tfuna, is also feminine. But the major focus here, the sort of the larger aggregate of all wisdom, is feminine, and most of the pieces of the corollaries that come under her umbrella are also feminine. So that's extremely important. Okay, other things you notice? There must have been some folks here that noticed something familiar and probably said, I had no idea that came from here. I thought this only happened during a certain ritual moment in Jewish life, which was what?
That would be
Alan, what did you notice?
that's line 18, Eitz Chaim.
Right.
We sing that
Mhm,
during
When
the
do we sing
Torah,
that?
when we place the Torah back in the ark.
mhm.
Right. It's a very interesting, right? N17 as well. Drachecha darchei noam v'chol nativoteha shalom. And then we get to Eitz Chaim here. It's done in a different order with some other verses that are inserted, but it's a ritual of returning the tree of life, which here is the Torah, through a path, which Marian noticed is the path of the recessional, leading the Torah back into her resting place within the ark of the covenant, which is the centerpiece. It's the hearth of the community, and so she returns into the ark. The ark is closed, and she is acknowledged as being a tree of life. So we don't really often understand the context of this ritual, but it's really quite a profound moment when you think about what we're ritualizing. We're saying something very unique here about the role of wisdom and the centrality of wisdom in the Jewish community, which is embodied in the Sefer Torah, the scroll of the Pentateuch that we read from three times, at least 3 to 4 times a week in community. That's the central axis of community. And this recessional, processional is daring to articulate the paths, her paths. Again, in verse 17, it's clear, daracheha, netivoteha, and that's the reason why it's capitalized. And she is a tree of life. Eitz Chaim, he is chokhmah. So she is a tree of life. This image of the tree, which we're not going to get into as deeply as I would like today, is a very, very important archetypal symbol in Judaism. The Eitz Chaim in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism is a central feature of mystical gnosis. But that's on the esoteric side. On the exoteric side, this is a foundational symbol of normative Jewish life, that we have an Eitz Chaim, and she is the anchor of the community. And we're going to take a look and see how it's been excerpted from this whole section. And we need to try to understand, why is it that these two verses are used for the central pillar of building community. I think it's very important to try to appreciate the pshat, the context, and then how the rabbis and the liturgists have decided to recontextualize this, and what's the message that is being conveyed here. It's very, very interesting to think about that. So we're going to come back to that as we go through it again. Goldie?
When I think of the tree of life, I think of something that nourishes you.
Mm-hmm.
As, let's say, if giving life, but as the Torah would nourish you as well, and wisdom would as well.
Mm-hmm. So it's fitting then, right? It's nourishing, and if it's nourishing, looking at the qualities of nourishment that we've seen so far earlier on, then that would be a maternal quality. Torah is
That's
also
right.
Torah is likened to water. Torah is likened to breast milk. There are a lot of
Yeah.
maternal, as you call them, nourishing qualities. So a tree is only nourishing insofar as it nourishes us through what? It doesn't have water. It requires water and sun.
Mm.
It doesn't have milk. What does a tree have?
Fruit.
Fruit. And
Oh,
where do we encounter
fruit.
the Eitz HaChaim?
In the Garden of Eden.
That's right. So it's another important thing that's resonating here is that we have to remember these are bookends that are speaking to each other. Mishle is speaking to the book of Genesis, and it's in a way of rereading the book of Genesis, and that's something that is important to remember. So what were the two trees that were in the garden in chapter 2 of Genesis? In the midst of the garden. Remember the placement too, very important, which we'll come back to after. What were the two trees, Alan?
Tree of knowledge and the tree of life.
So there was the Eitz HaChaim, there was the Hei HaYediah, Eitz HaChaim, and there was the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. Now, which was the tree from which Adam and Eve ate?
Knowledge.
Knowledge.
Knowledge, good and evil, not from,
Tree of life.
No.
and this is the tree of life. So it's interesting to see now that we start to think about it a little further. In the midst of the garden, these trees, or potentially this intertwined series of trees, in the midst of the garden, were what led to what? What did humanity experience after eating from this specific tree of knowledge, good and evil?
Ultimately, expulsion from the garden.
That's right. This is the human condition of exile and expulsion is a function of eating either with improper intention or from the wrong tree or in the wrong order. But whatever happened in the garden led to our expulsion from the garden, which is a more bucolic pastoral setting, into what was east of Eden, and eventually through the book of Genesis becomes what? What is east of Eden? Lisa, you're muted. Do you want to say? What's east of Eden?
Jerusalem? I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Well, Eden is imagined actually as Jerusalem.
Oh.
So that's an interesting quandary because eventually Jerusalem becomes what is east of Eden, which is what's east of Eden? What is it that's first built once you leave the bucolic setting of the garden? Cities and civilization, right? So Eden is a representation of
Life.
paradise, but it's a representation of paradise. But civilization, the city, commerce, tools, all the things that
Yeah,
that we
life.
build are east of Eden. If you look through the genealogy stories and the building of cities, that's what happens in the process of expulsion. So the purpose of the story is to teach us how we were expelled from this perfect state of knowing into the human condition of either contaminated or corrupted knowledge, or into a place of unknowing. So we have to relearn what we knew in the garden, or what the sages say later, what we knew in the womb. We are then thrown out into the world. We're cast out into the world. We're expelled from the womb, and we lose all of our knowledge that we knew of the Torah, and we spend our lives trying to remember, to relearn what we knew. And that's the human condition. It's an expulsion from the garden, and we have to relearn the knowledge that we could have had, but that we lost the opportunity to learn. And now east of Eden, in the city, we have to learn knowledge, not from the tree of knowledge, good and evil, because we ate from that. But now we have to return, ironically, in the city, which is the most paradoxical place to do anything that requires a kind of spiritual intention, in the most difficult place at the crossroads of commerce and civilization. Now we have to learn from and to eat from Eitz HaChaim. And so what has Judaism done in order to remind us of that in terms of the ritual? It ritualizes not the tree of knowledge, good and evil, as a thrice weekly activity, or a thrice daily act. It's thrice weekly, 3 times during the week. It says that especially on Mondays and Thursdays, which were the times when you come to the city to engage in commerce, that's when you're supposed to cleave to the Eitz HaChaim. In the midst of the nitty-gritty of life, this is the time to also embrace wisdom. It's a very, very interesting ritual that we have, and we don't always think about what it means and the lines that are liturgized relative to the actions that we are embodying. It's a very, very interesting agenda the rabbis have set up. They're saying that the ultimate knowledge of immortality that makes us immortal, which Adam and Eve did not eat from, is what you can find in the course of the nitty-gritty of daily life. That it is possible to become enlightened in the midst of commerce and civilization. That's a very different spiritual model than many other wisdom schools were preaching at the time. And remember, we've spoken about this, especially in the Hellenistic period. Many of the Greek mystery cults were disintegrating the family structure because primarily men, but also women, were leaving the family units to go off in search of Sophia and leading ascetic lives, right? And that becomes a problem because it disintegrates the family structure, and it also requires a seclusion from commercial life and civilization. Like, for example, we saw in the Jewish community at Qumran. We weren't immune to it. It's just that in the Greek world, the mystery cults were much more prevalent. But Judaism tried that experiment in Qumran. How many of you have been to the caves of Qumran when you visited Eretz Yisrael? Remember what those caves are? They're very important caves because it was a reclusive community that decided to withdraw from Jerusalem. So Elisa, here, the Jerusalem that the Essenes during the Second Temple period leave behind actually is a city that has become too commercialized. That's the irony, right? Their critique is they're saying, we want to live and to eat from the Eitz HaChaim, but you can't do that in the city because the temple, which is supposed to be the Garden of Eden, has been polluted by all the commerce that surrounds the Temple Mount. Remember who else was complaining about that besides the Essenes?
Jesus.
Jesus.
That's right. Right. So it's a tension you find in the Second Temple period. His critique was not at all original. It just became another religion. But we have evidence from the caves in Qumran, and the next time you get to go to the scroll, the Museum of the Scroll of the Book in Israel, you can actually see the scrolls that come from the caves in Qumran, and you see the way that they were reading scripture. It's an absolutely fascinating exercise to see how they were reading many of the books that we read. They have their own forms of commentary called pesher, and they had scrolls that were not canonized as part of the Hebrew Bible, but they were reading the library that became, or that was from which the Hebrew Bible emerged. And so it's a very, very interesting thing to look at and to see. I haven't looked yet to see whether we have a pesher that exists for Proverbs, but it would be something that I need to do to look to see how they were reading these specific verses, and they had specific interpretations. Their pesher, and you can see it in maybe next time I'll bring you some examples of it so you can appreciate it, is a form of intercalation, which means you'll have the verse, but intercalated, sort of squished inside of the verse, is their commentary. So it's very difficult to understand and to make a distinction between their commentary and the text itself. It was a living oral tradition that they taught as a form of instruction in the community, but their commentary was integrated into the text itself. It's a fascinating period. Anyways, I bring it up because there was that's an example of what the canonized text in Judaism says not to do, which is to leave community behind in search of the Eitz HaChaim, this elusive, mysterious tree of nourishment is planted in the center, in the midst of the community, and not in some paradisiacal garden that is on retreat. That's the project of Judaism. And at least from the Bible till the Second Temple period, that worked because we had a place that in a sense enshrined architecturally both of these trees, but specifically this Eitz HaChaim. And if you look through the temple architecture, the first temple and the second temple, you'll notice that much of it is structured around the celestial garden. Jerusalem becomes this bridge. So terrestrial Jerusalem and celestial Jerusalem meet on the Temple Mount, and the architecture of the first and second temple are meant to symbolize that union of upper and lower Jerusalem. And we still focus on that, more on the destruction than on the living embodiment of the physical space, because that physical space is basically destroyed now. All we have left is what on the Temple Mount or surrounding it?
A wall.
Right. We have an outer. We have the ruins of of a supporting retaining wall. That's all that's left. So it's very interesting to see how we've survived for so long amidst the ruins. And it's very interesting as well. I urge you to reread this chapter on Friday, tomorrow, because it's one of the few times in the history of our calendars where on the 25th of December, we're also going to be in the midst of the 10th of Tevet, Asar Tevet. What does Asar Tevet symbolize in the Jewish calendar? It's a fast day. It's very rare that Christmas and this fast day coincide. But what does Asar Tevet mark? Why is it a fast day?
Don't remember.
It marks the destruction of the first temple. The destruction of the first temple of Beit Rishon happens on the 10th of Tevet. And then when the second temple was built, that fast fell into abeyance. And then once the second temple was destroyed, which is memorialized on what date on the Jewish calendar?
Tisha B'Av.
The 9th of Av. Then the 10th of Tevet was reinstated. So it's very interesting. There was a hope that with the second temple, there would no longer be a need to mourn the destruction of the first. And so the fast, which atones for the destruction, was removed. And then once the second temple was destroyed, it was reinstated. So all we have left, actually, of the temple, aside from the retaining wall, are 2 days of mourning on the Jewish calendar. So that's the question that remains. Where can wisdom be found when your two central addresses, the repositories of wisdom, have been destroyed? What does Judaism do? It pivots and says we no longer are required to go to one central address as the source of our wisdom. We are now going to take this tree and we're going to uproot it because the land has, in a sense, the house has been, the arborarium has been destroyed once again. And we must plant this tree symbolically as a ritual in the diasporic realm of our existence in every single synagogue. This will be the center of the community. There will be an ark, there will be an eternal light, and there will be a Sefer Torah called the Eitz Chaim, because we no longer can go and find that in Jerusalem. So it's a very interesting program. The rabbis understood very clearly what they were doing. After 70 CE, as they say, sitting in the vineyards of Yavne, they looked back over their shoulder and they saw the raised hills of Jerusalem, and they decided at a certain point that they had to recreate Judaism. It was a paradigm crash that led to a paradigm shift, and that was the birthing of Rabbinic Judaism, which was no longer temple-based. It was no longer Jerusalem-centric. And you could say either that was the birth of the diaspora and the synagogue, or it was the replanting of the tree of life, which really is meant to grow in the center of Jerusalem everywhere. So maybe it was also extending the boundaries of Jerusalem everywhere, or it's the theory of diaspora. But whatever perspective you take, the program happens by the rabbis' courageous rereading of these very obscure verses that would otherwise be lost in some wisdom curriculum that most people don't read anymore. And they said, we're going to go back into chapter 3 and we're going to reboot the system. We're going to create a new paradigm, and we're going to make a link between the Eitz Chaim that's spoken of here, woman wisdom, and the ritual that we have of Torah reading that happens 3 times a week in Jewish community. So just try to appreciate how radical a move that is from the world of biblical religion through Second Temple Judaism, and then after post 70 CE, after the destruction of the first temple, that we're going to mark on the 10th of Tevet for the first time, which occurs on the 25th of December, which marks what? What is the 25th of December on the Gregorian calendar, Mark?
Birth of Jesus.
Right, which is the move from, it also sets the calendar and the time of counting and the way that secular Western civilization marks time. So what did we call that moment on the calendar? Not just the 25th of December, but ultimately that sets in motion what most of us probably grew up with, unless the rabbi corrects us, when we would say what happened before 0 on the calendar was BC, and then afterwards was AD. I just spoke to my nephew about this, and he had no idea what he was saying when he was using that language. And I said, well, don't you know what that means? What does BC mean?
Before
Before
Christ.
Christ.
And what does
Before
AD
Christ.
and what does AD mean?
After death,
After
after his death.
Anno Domini,
Anno
Right. Well,
Domini.
in Latin, what it's right. So what does that mean, Morton, in Latin?
in the year of our Lord.
Yeah, it's not just after death, but it's the year of our Lord when he rose, right? He was crucified and resurrected. And so when we use something as simple as BC and AD, we are, in a sense, professing our allegiance to a system of time that structures our lives that as Jews, we don't believe in. I would hope. I mean, or maybe I don't know, but I don't believe in it.
Well,
I
that's,
respect it, but it's just appreciate when the rabbis were looking at 70 CE. Just one second, Shirley. 70 CE, the temple, the physical temple was destroyed. So our space marker was destroyed. What did they do? They shifted not only the Eitz Chaim to be in every space of the diaspora in the synagogue, but they also, in a sense, created a way of marking time, which was to build a temple in time through the Hebrew calendar. And the Hebrew calendar is, in many ways, is a response to the birth of Christianity that begins to emerge and the New Testament. All these things are happening at the same time, and power and authority through the application of wisdom in each of these different schools, eventually, once it's melded with political power and it creates a calendar, makes a shift from sacred space of the temple to sacred time. So there's a lot at stake when we use words like markers like BC and AD as opposed to BCE and CE. And there's a lot of importance that we vest in the Hebrew calendar as a way of building a temple in time. So on Friday, take some time to reflect on that, Shirley.
so it's the same with New Year's, because New Year's is called the Feast of the Circumcision,
Hmm.
which marks the Brit Milah.
Yep.
And
Perfect timing.
yes, so so many people don't know that is what it is, actually.
Hmm. It is what it is. That's the truth. So once you start looking at time in that way, it starts to look very different. And wisdom is also about making time count. We're going to see, if you notice, after verse 18, what is it that we learn about time? Try to look now back at this text and understand what is the temporal nature, or the temporality, the nature of time in which Chokhmah emerges into our awareness. And this happens throughout, especially in chapters 8 and 9 that we're going to look at later. But it's a shift now from a curriculum about character, and then suddenly once you encounter this tree in verses 19 onwards, especially 19 and 20, what is 19 and 20 describing?
It's understanding and knowledge.
But
It's
yes,
creation.
it's primordial time.
Yeah.
It's going back to creation that leads to understanding and knowledge. But it's saying the blueprint of creation is wisdom. And this is what allowed there to be a shift from eternal time or eternity to the experience of temporal time that we now have as a calendar, where we mark day 1, day 2, day 3, right? When we mark months, we mark years. But before that, there was nothing but eternity. And then as we move forward, Elisa, you have to unmute.
I can wait until you finished your idea.
Okay, well, I'm going to move on to the next shift, which goes back to the curriculum. So you might want to say something here if you're talking about primordial time.
I mean, as we're talking about this, what I wonder about is like, what is the radical shift that we have to make? Where are we going to relocate that tree? And I'm thinking about that a lot right now, because we're in a place where during the pandemic where marking time is irrelevant. Like, it's like we've lost our sense of time and our connection to the calendar. And even before the pandemic, there's this shift away from in Jewish community in general from being tied to the calendar. Like it no longer is the central focus of most Jews, non-Orthodox Jews.
Pre-pandemic, you're
life.
saying?
Yeah, pre-pandemic even. So where like, does this text have anything to tell us about how and where to relocate the tree?
I think that's a good challenge. I've already suggested 2 ways it does. By studying Torah as anchors for the week, Monday, Thursday, and Saturday. That creates a temple in time no matter where you are, whether you're in a community or on Zoom or on your own, as a spiritual practice, as well as putting Torah as the center of the font of all wisdom that we have in our lives, Torah writ large, in terms of the process of learning and ritualizing our lives. I think there's a lot to be said about that here. So Marian, and then I'm going to go on just a tiny bit more. Yep.
I'm wondering, Rabbi, if everything you've said about this, the change in the sense of time, is also a way of regulating trauma, because when you mentioned that there's just 2 days, that now we reintroduced the second day back from the
second fast day, right, for the first temple, yeah.
And that it's prescribed even down to the rhythm of our week as to how and when we can get comfort from the trauma that is always present, and yet we have to, in order to get on with things, we have to sort of we have to control our experience of catastrophe in a way. Otherwise, it's overwhelming.
Right. That's a very important thing to remember, and that Judaism always tempers on the calendar. The genius of the calendar is to oscillate between fast days and feast days, which is what Christianity understood, right? The birth of Christianity didn't happen in a vacuum, and surely, as you point out, the move and the shift from the birth to the circumcision, I mean, you could say that it's a birth, but also on a certain level it's a death, because it's a celebration of the rebirth and the resurrection. So it's sort of an interesting riff on what Judaism does, which is much more consistent, which is to say we have fast days and we have feast days. And eventually our fast days will be transformed into feast days. But for now, we have more fasting than feasting, right? I'm just thinking about the example of the temple. We have 2 fast days for the temple, but is there a holiday where we actually celebrate the temple?
Okay.
So we have 1 day where we rededicate it. We have 8-day cycle where we rededicate it. So that's a good example where we rededicate it and we sing Psalms of Hallel. So, but again, I mean, unless you say that because it's 8 days, that supersedes the 2 days of fasting, there's really only, I think, one instance, maybe that, and maybe Yom Yerushalayim, where we celebrate the reunification of Jerusalem. But that's really more about land than it is about the temple. So we really only have, right now, we tend to have a lot of these minor fast days, because if you think about it, there's more than just 2. Aside from the 10th of Tevet for the first temple, the 9th of Av for the second temple, there's also Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, which is the 3 weeks leading up to the catastrophe of the second temple. So Marian's right, is that there's this tendency, or this concern that the rabbis are aware of, an anxiety that if we mourn too much and we fast too much, we'll never live. And so the Eitz Chaim is meant to remind us. Remember, the Eitz Chaim is a symbol of wisdom, and the Torah is called an Eitz Chaim. It's also called a Sam L'Chaim, which means that it's an elixir for life. And the opposite that we're going to encounter again and again, the abject horror image, which is the mirror side of the Eitz HaChaim, in many ways is the Eitz Hara, or the Eitz Hamavet, right? It is the image of the stranger woman that takes us into Sheol, and it's the image of death. And so there's a flash of that that's encountered in the Garden of Eden by encountering the tree of knowledge, good and evil, right? There's always that temptation to eat from that tree. And so the instruction that the disciple has here from the mentor and from the sage is be careful, because at every moment you're back in the garden. At every moment you have a choice of which tree to eat from. And make sure that you're following the curriculum so that you don't become seduced by the snake, right? The snake is just another image of wisdom gone awry. And that's the image of the stranger woman, of wisdom gone awry. And so this is a warning. And we'll see as we go through the curriculum that what's interesting is there's an amulet that's spoken about here. It's not entirely clear what the amulet is. It's not tefillin because it goes around your neck. So it's not entirely clear. It must have been some kind of an ancient amulet. It could have been an amulet that had part of the scroll inside of it. Like we see a mezuzah or tefillin are all amulets that we still carry forward. But if then you look at this next section, it shifts from the cosmic to the interpersonal, right? Bursting from the ancient ocean to the skies dripped this dew, which was knowledge, this da'at. And then you have to make sure, don't let these things slip away from you. Protect yourself, remind yourself with an amulet, and then you can walk forward, as Marian said, without stumbling. And so that when you sleep, you won't be afraid and terrified. There won't be a sense of terror or insecurity. And then it's about interpersonal relationships, right? So verses 28 are all about neighborly relations. Look at how granular this is. This is about interpersonal ethics, which speaks to not the cosmos. It's not cosmic awareness here. This is about character development. But the genius of the book here is that you can only develop your character if you have cosmic consciousness. And your cosmic consciousness only has lasting value if it influences your character development that you pass on and that you model, not only to your children, but also to your disciples, as well as to your neighbors. So it's very concerned with the way that family and community are being built up and being solidified. These are meant to be teachings that are embodied and integrated into life. And the whole question, for example, in verse 4, of what it is that we mean here by this strange expression I translated, chen v'sechel tov, grace and good regard. It's kind of awkward to translate it that way, but here's what we're trying to get at here is chen v'sechel tov. What does it mean if you use your seichel? What did your Bubby and Zadie teach you about seichel, right? As opposed to this being pasnish, Shirley, they say to you, use your seichel, Shirley. What does that mean?
Your inner knowledge, inner understanding that has come from the teachings that you've been given, right?
Yes. So, anyone have another way of translating it or describing it? Use your seichel,
Good.
Alan.
Use your personal wisdom that you've been developing over time or that I have taught you.
Right. So personal wisdom, and Morton said good sense, or what we sometimes call common sense. Now, common sense is a cliche. We don't really know how to describe it, but everybody knows what it means. The commonsensical thing would be to act this way and not that way. Just use your common sense, right? And politicians love to use and abuse that term, but seichel is common sense more than it is about knowledge and wisdom, which have their own terms. Knowledge is da'at, wisdom is chokhmah, but seichel is different. Chen v'sechel tov is something to think about. And I'll close today with some thoughts on just this word seichel, because it's used in Yiddish, and then it becomes bantied about as a cliche in English about common sense. But what do we really mean by seichel in verse 4? Okay, specifically seichel tov. It actually really means intelligence or cognition, but that's hard to really process for us. It sounds too technical. So the idiom is to talk about it as common sense, here to find grace and good regard. But common sense is the ability to look at a situation and to know how to process this combination of seeing and understanding and knowing how to act in a given situation. It goes back to the garden again, Genesis 3:6 talks about the tree that was lovely to look at, lehaskil, which is using the root seichel. So when something is lovely to look at, you have to know how to see and understand what to do. The good regard comes from the lovely to look at situation of the tree, but seichel goes deeper than this. That's where it starts in the garden. It goes a little deeper, and it makes us consider. Welcome, Bev. It makes us consider when we talk about seichel, what is intelligence really about? You know, we say someone can be wise, but do they really have seichel? Right? Is someone who's a chacham, do they really have seichel? You could be a chacham, you could be a wise person, but you may not have seichel. It's not just common sense, but it also is the sense of street smarts, right? That's also another way of looking at it, right? So have street smarts, know how to navigate the world. So there is this sense within seichel, and within, as you go deeper into Jewish philosophy, you realize that there's different levels of the seichel. So the Maharal of Prague, for example, makes a distinction between chitzoniut haSeichel and pnimiut haSeichel. That is, there is the exterior form or the exterior part of intelligence, and then there's the interior aspect of seichel. And most of the time in our lives, we tend to operate on the exterior side of our intelligence. And for example, when we're trying to navigate the world through street smarts, that's our chitzoniyut haseichel. But there's a deeper part that has to inspire that navigation system that makes the system run, which is the pnimiyut haseichel, the interior intelligence. And we have to cultivate a deeper consciousness to become attuned to these higher density levels of our intelligence. And Reb Nachman of Breslov, a great Hasidic master, said that we actually have many sichliot. We have what we would call today multiple intelligences, right? We know that within education, the educators are nodding their heads, right? That we say sometimes we have multiple modalities of learning, but we also have multiple intelligences. Some people may have emotional intelligence or social emotional intelligence. There's all these different sichliot that he speaks about. And in the Hasidic world, they're very aware that people learn in different ways. We have different spiritual intelligences as well. So I want to leave you with that thought, just to consider the way that you learn most effectively, and more specifically, what is the seichel tov, the chen v'seichel tov, the good regard and the common sense that allows you to navigate your world in a meaningful way. Where did you learn, and where are you learning that common sense from? And how do you relate your common sense that you bring to the exterior world? How does it relate to your inner life, to the pnimiyut haseichel for you? And where do you take time in the midst of your week to cultivate and refine the pnimiyut haseichel so that your common sense is connected to an operating system that is well functioning and well oiled? And I say that after the conclusion of Hanukkah, we think of the residue of the oil, the shemen zayit zach, that pure, pristine olive oil that is meant to illumine the Chanukiah. And in many ways, it's meant for Reb Nachman. He sees both the Chanukiah and the dreidel as symbols of sichliot, of different spiritual intelligences that we have to allow ourselves to continue to burn and to fuel who we are long after the spinning of the dreidels has ended and long after we pack up the Chanukiah. But the residual image of light is supposed to inspire not just our common sense on the outside, which is the chitzoniyut haseichel, but also the inner light that drives the machine. That's what the Hasidic world many centuries later suggests that we have to tend to in the midst of the garden, and in that distinctly urban environment where the tree of life sits. Let us consider this week how we take time to embrace and to be fueled and inspired by the light of Torah in our lives together. A comment from Bev.
You were saying something about street smarts. Typically when people use the phrase, it's an innate intelligence. Who knows where it comes from? But it's the counter to
Kishkas.
There, yeah, it's the counter to the person who spent all the years in school, but the guy who has street smarts is supposed to be the real chocham, you know?
Right, right. So you could be a PhD from the ivory tower and not know how to close a deal, and you're a chacham who lives in a tower. But the seichel one is the one who knows how to make a deal to finish the deal, right? And one has nothing to do with the other. These dichotomies that we set up, that we counterpose, but the balanced life is the ability to integrate both.
Right.
It's important to have seichel and chochmah.
Right.
And as I'm suggesting, there are many sichliot to think about in terms of the way that we live our lives.